It was early morning when Cairo woke up. The sun had barely begun to rise over the thick pine forest that stretched endlessly beyond his cabin. Birds chirped softly, and a faint chill lingered in the air. He sat up on his simple straw bedding, ran a rough hand over his unshaven face, and listened to the silence. To him, this silence was comfort. It was the quiet of a world unburdened by people's noise and lies. Cairo was a hunter, and he lived alone. Each day was the same. He would wake before dawn, sharpen his knives, check his traps, and walk the same familiar trails. Sometimes, he caught rabbits or deer. Other times, he caught nothing and simply enjoyed the cold wind brushing against his cheek as he walked beneath towering pines. That morning felt no different, yet something in his chest felt restless. He pushed it aside, strapping his bow over his shoulder, and stepped outside. The air bit at his skin. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. His boots crunched over the frost as he made his way down the narrow trail. It twisted and curved between dark tree trunks, leading him deeper into the forest where his traps were set. The quiet was peaceful, but he remained alert. Predators sometimes prowled these woods, wolves, bears, and sometimes, things stranger still. After checking his first few traps and finding nothing but a snapped branch, he moved on to the next. As he approached the clearing where he had set a small snare trap, he froze. There, kneeling beside the trap, was a creature unlike anything he had seen before. At first, he thought it was just a fox, its fur a shimmering blue under the early morning light. But then it turned to look at him, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a girl. Or at least, partly a girl. Her ears twitched atop her head, covered in velvety blue fur that faded into pure white at the tips. Long hair the color of midnight pooled down her back, tangled with dry leaves and twigs. A bushy tail curled protectively around her legs, its blue and white fur trembling with every frightened breath. Her eyes widened as she stared at him. They were a brilliant, pale blue, almost glowing, and filled with terror. She clutched her slender arms around her chest as if trying to make herself smaller. She wore only a ragged shawl around her shoulders, barely enough to shield her from the cold dawn air. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind rustled softly through the pine needles above, sending down a whisper of frost. Cairo slowly reached for his bow. His mind told him this was unnatural. Dangerous. The old stories always warned about fox spirits and their tricks. If she was a spirit, sparing her could curse him. If she was an animal, sparing her could mean losing his next meal. Yet his hand paused. His eyes narrowed as he looked at her again. She was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Her ears lay flat against her skull in fear. The snare hadn't closed around her leg, but she was stuck between the trap's pegs, unable to move without cutting herself. She made a small whimpering sound, and his chest tightened. "Stay still," he said gruffly, his voice deeper than he intended. She flinched, pressing herself further against the ground. Cairo knelt beside her, taking care not to touch her just yet. He carefully removed the trap pegs, loosening the snare. Her eyes followed his every move, wide with confusion and terror. When the trap was free, she remained crouched, staring at him. Her tail curled tighter around her legs. "Go," he muttered, gesturing into the trees. "Get out of here before something else finds you." But she didn't move. She continued staring at him, her blue eyes shimmering with something unreadable. Fear, yes, but also curiosity. Her ears twitched towards him as if listening to the cadence of his voice. Cairo sighed. "Go on. I'm not going to hurt you." Slowly, she rose to her feet. Her legs were slender and strong, ending in small clawed feet with tufts of white fur at the ankles. She was small, barely reaching his chest in height. She took a cautious step back, then another, her gaze never leaving his. He waited until she disappeared between the pine trunks, her bushy blue tail vanishing into the shadows. Only then did he stand up and sling his bow across his back. His chest felt tight with a feeling he couldn't name. He returned to his cabin at midday with 2 rabbits strung from his belt. As he cleaned and skinned them outside, he found his thoughts drifting back to the fox girl's trembling form. Her wide blue eyes haunted him. He shook his head and forced himself to focus on his work. Spirits or not, he had no place in his life for strange creatures. That night, the wind howled outside his small cabin, rattling the shutters. He sat by the fireplace, eating rabbit stew and watching the flames flicker against the stone hearth. Every now and then, his eyes drifted to the window. He told himself he was listening for wolves. But deep down, he knew he was hoping to see a flash of blue fur in the moonlit snow. The following morning came with thick mist curling between the trees. Cairo woke up before dawn, just as he always did, and prepared for the day. He strapped on his hunting knife and bow, threw his thick fur cloak over his shoulders, and stepped out into the silent gray forest. For the first few hours, his routine continued as normal. He checked his snares and found a single squirrel, which he quickly cleaned and stored in his pack. The mist made the world feel muted and distant. Every tree seemed like a shadow of itself, every sound muffled and far away. But he wasn't alone. At first, he only sensed it, that prickling awareness that he was being watched. He turned quickly more than once, expecting a wolf or perhaps a bear. Yet each time, the trees stood silent, their trunks vanishing into white fog. Then, as he crouched to inspect a track in the soft earth, he caught a flash of blue from the corner of his eye. His breath hitched, and he slowly looked over his shoulder. There, half hidden behind a cedar tree, was the fox girl. Her ears twitched nervously, and her bushy blue tail curled around her knees as she crouched low. Her eyes were locked onto him with an intensity that made his chest tighten again. She didn't move. She only watched. Cairo straightened and scowled. "Why are you following me?" She flinched at his tone, her ears flattening slightly, but she didn't run away. Her eyes widened, and she shifted her small clawed feet in the dirt, hugging her tail tighter around herself. He sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Go back to wherever you came from." "I'm not. I can't help you." Still, she didn't move. The morning breeze lifted her dark hair, revealing the small triangular markings beneath her eyes, pale crescent shapes on each cheek that glowed faintly in the dawn light. They were beautiful in a way that made him uneasy, like a spirit's markings in the old legends. Cairo turned away, forcing himself to continue down the trail. He felt her gaze burning into his back as he walked away. A part of him expected her to leave, to vanish into the mist like a frightened animal. But he soon heard the faint crunch of her steps following behind him. He stopped again, spun around, and she froze mid-step. Her hands clasped in front of her chest, her ears drooping in submission. He could see the faint tremble in her shoulders. "Don't follow me," he said, his voice gentler this time. "It's dangerous out here." She blinked slowly, tilting her head slightly. The movement reminded him so much of an animal trying to understand human speech that it almost made him smile. Almost. He turned away and continued walking. Again, he heard her following. The rest of the morning passed like this. Each time he stopped, she stopped. Each time he turned, she froze. She didn't come too close. Always 10 paces behind, her presence silent yet impossible to ignore. At midday, he built a small fire to boil water for tea. As he sat on a fallen log, sipping the steaming brew from a dented tin cup, he watched her from the corner of his eye. She crouched behind a nearby tree, peeking out with those luminous blue eyes. Her ears twitched with each sip he took, and her tail coiled tightly around her knees. "Are you hungry?" he asked suddenly. She jumped as if he'd shouted, and her ears pressed flat against her skull. She shook her head quickly, eyes wide. He frowned. Her cheeks were hollow, and her arms looked thinner than he remembered. He reached into his pack, pulled out a small strip of dried rabbit meat, and held it out towards her. "Here," he said. "Eat." She stared at the meat, then at him. Her gaze lingered on his face, studying him as if trying to read something deeper than his words. Slowly, she rose to her feet and approached, her movements cautious and silent. She stopped just out of his reach, hesitating. "It's not poisoned," he said with a tired sigh. Her ears flicked forward at his voice. She stepped closer, trembling slightly, and reached out with slender fingers tipped in small claws. When she took the meat from his hand, her fingertips brushed his rough palm. A small electric jolt shot through his arm at the contact, but he ignored it. She scurried back to her spot beneath the cedar tree and sat cross-legged, nibbling at the meat with small, sharp teeth. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, her tail twitching with quiet joy. He watched her for a while, then stood and packed away his kettle. "Stay here," he said. "I need to check the traps near the stream." But as he walked away, he heard her soft footsteps behind him once again. He didn't try to stop her this time. They reached the stream by late afternoon. The water flowed gently between mossy stones, its surface reflecting the pale gray sky above. Cairo crouched to wash his hands while she stood nearby, staring at her rippling reflection. He watched her through the corner of his eye. Her tail swished lightly as she bent to touch the water with cautious fingers. When the cold touched her skin, she yipped softly and pulled back, shaking her hand and glaring at the stream as if it had betrayed her. A small laugh escaped Cairo's throat before he could stop it. The sound startled both of them. Her ears perked forward, and her eyes widened at the sight of his smile. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cold breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp moss. She tilted her head, her gaze locked onto his lips as if memorizing the shape of his smile. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered, feeling heat rise to his cheeks. He splashed water over his face to hide it. When he looked up again, she was still staring at him, her tail swishing slowly behind her. The sky darkened as they made their way back to his cabin. The fox girl followed silently, her footsteps light and almost soundless on the forest floor. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant howl of wolves. She shivered and pressed closer to him, her ears flat against her head. He glanced at her, then sighed heavily. "Fine. You can stay near the cabin tonight. But you're not coming inside." Her ears perked up slightly at his words, and her tail gave a small, happy flick. He felt something tighten in his chest at the sight. When they reached the clearing, he pointed to a spot beneath the wooden awning by the woodpile. "Stay there. It'll block the wind. I'll bring you a blanket." Her eyes widened, glowing faintly in the moonlight. She clasped her hands together, bowing her head towards him. It almost looked like a gesture of worship, though he tried to push that thought away. Inside, he rummaged through his chest and pulled out an old wool blanket. When he returned outside, she was crouched where he told her, hugging her knees to her chest. He draped the blanket over her shoulders, and she shivered at the touch of his hands but did not pull away. "Sleep," he said quietly. "It's warmer if you stay still." She looked up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. For a moment, he felt an almost magnetic pull towards her, something primal and unspoken that coiled low in his stomach. He clenched his jaw and pulled away quickly. "Good night," he muttered, turning back into the cabin and closing the door firmly behind him. That night, as he lay on his straw bedding by the fireplace, he listened to the soft rustle of movement outside. He imagined her small form curled up beneath the blanket, her ears twitching with every night sound. Something about it felt right. And that thought frightened him more than anything else in these woods. The next morning dawned pale and cold. Frost covered the clearing outside Cairo's cabin, glittering like a sea of diamonds under the early sun. He rose from his bedding with a stiff groan, rolled his shoulders to ease the ache, and moved to the small window to look outside. There she was. The fox girl sat curled beneath the blanket he had given her, her knees tucked under her chin, long hair draped like midnight silk over her shoulders. Her ears twitched at every forest sound, and puffs of cold air rose from her lips with each exhale. She looked so small and fragile against the vast whiteness around her. He stepped away from the window with a sigh. Part of him hoped she would have left during the night, returning to wherever fox spirits came from. But a deeper part of him felt relieved to see her there, as if her presence proved he hadn't merely dreamed her into existence. Cairo lit the hearth fire and prepared his simple breakfast, salted rabbit stew warmed over coals. As the scent filled the cabin, he heard a faint scratching at the door. He turned, frowning. The scratching came again, followed by a soft whimper. He opened the door to find her standing there, hugging the blanket around her shoulders. Her ears were drooping low, and her eyes shimmered with hesitant hope as she looked up at him. "You can't come in," he said, his voice gruff from sleep. It's not right." She tilted her head, blinking slowly, then let out a small chittering sound deep in her throat. Her tail curled around her legs as she stood shivering in the doorway. Cairo sighed deeply. He stepped aside. "Fine. But don't touch anything." She stepped inside on silent feet, her claws clicking lightly against the wooden floor. Her nose twitched as she sniffed the warm air, her ears perking up at the crackling fire. She walked to the hearth and crouched before it, extending her small clawed hands towards the flames, sighing softly at the warmth. He watched her for a moment, then returned to stirring the stew. "Hungry?" She glanced back over her shoulder, ears flicking. Her tail swished lightly in anticipation. He ladled out a small bowl and handed it to her. She took it with both hands, bowing her head deeply before bringing it to her lips. She drank carefully, her small fangs visible as she sipped the hot broth. Her eyes closed in bliss, and her ears fluttered slightly with each swallow. The sight made something deep in Cairo's chest soften in a way that felt both comforting and dangerous. When she finished, she placed the bowl on the floor and bowed low again, her forehead almost touching the wooden boards. "You don't need to do that," he muttered, looking away. "I'm not your master." But she didn't respond, only kept her head bowed in silent obedience. He felt a strange heat rise to his cheeks and quickly stood, gathering his hunting gear. He slung his bow over his shoulder and moved towards the door. "Stay here," he ordered without thinking. She looked up sharply, her ears perked forward with sudden alertness. Her tail wagged once behind her before she lowered her gaze submissively and nodded. Her claws lightly gripped the edge of the blanket around her shoulders as she curled up by the fire. Cairo stepped outside, breathing in the biting morning air. He tried to focus on his traps and hunting routes, but his mind kept drifting back to the image of her sitting obediently by his hearth, her bright blue eyes lowered in silent devotion. By midday, he had caught 2 rabbits and a pheasant. As he approached his cabin through the pines, he paused, listening. Inside, he could hear faint rustling and scratching. He frowned, quickly dropping into a silent crouch and moving to the window. There she was, exactly where he left her. But she wasn't just sitting by the fire. She was cleaning. Her small clawed hands moved with delicate precision as she picked up stray wood chips from the floor and placed them in a neat pile near the hearth. She wiped down his dented tin cups with the corner of her blanket, her ears flicking back and forth as she worked. Her tail swished gently behind her, brushing away dust in rhythmic strokes. Cairo stood there for a long moment, simply watching her. Something warm coiled low in his stomach at the sight of her so willingly tending to his home. He shook his head hard, forcing himself to step back from the window and enter through the door. She froze the moment he stepped inside. Her ears flattened, and she bowed deeply, pressing her forehead to the floor. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, revealing her slender back and the graceful arch of her spine. He swallowed hard, quickly turning away to hang his game on the wall hook. "You don't have to do that," he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Cleaning. Bowing. Just sit." She hesitated, then slowly rose to her knees, sitting back on her heels with her hands resting neatly on her lap. Her eyes stayed lowered, but a small, soft smile curved her lips. That smile made his chest tighten in a way he didn't understand. The days began to follow a quiet routine after that. Each morning, she would wake before him, sweeping the cabin floor with her tail and tidying whatever she could reach with her small hands. When he rose, she would bow silently and prepare the kettle for tea, her ears flicking back and forth to listen to his movements. She never spoke a word. Instead, she communicated with small gestures, tilts of her head, swishes of her tail, flicks of her ears. Yet somehow, Cairo always understood her meaning. One morning, as he prepared to leave for hunting, he found her crouched by the door, clutching the blanket tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes shimmered with worry as she looked up at him. He frowned. "I told you. Stay here." She shook her head firmly, her ears perked forward. She reached out and lightly touched the hem of his cloak with her clawed fingers. The gesture was so gentle and pleading that he felt his chest tighten painfully. He sighed heavily. "Fine. But stay close." Her ears twitched in joy, and she rose quickly to follow him into the snow-dusted forest. That day, she followed him like a silent shadow. When he crouched to inspect tracks, she crouched beside him, her nose twitching as she sniffed the cold air. When he set snares, she watched with wide, attentive eyes, memorizing every motion. At one point, he slipped on a patch of frozen moss. Before he could hit the ground, she darted forward and grabbed his cloak with surprising strength, steadying him. Her small hands clutched his sleeve, and her face was so close he could feel her warm breath against his neck. Their eyes locked for a brief, electrifying moment. Her pupils were wide, her cheeks flushed with cold and something else he couldn't name. His chest felt tight, heat rising up his throat despite the winter air. He pulled away quickly, muttering, "Thank you." She dipped her head low, ears flicking back in a show of obedience. But her tail swished once behind her, brushing lightly against his leg before she stepped back into her place behind him. That evening, they returned to the cabin together. As he skinned the rabbit she caught, her first successful snare, guided by his hands, she sat beside him, watching intently. When he finished, she leaned forward and nuzzled his arm lightly, her nose brushing against the rough fabric of his cloak. He froze at the contact, every nerve in his body alight with sensation. She pulled back quickly, ears pressed flat against her skull, as if fearing his anger. But Cairo only exhaled shakily, forcing his hands to keep working. "It's fine," he muttered. "You did well today." Her ears perked up instantly, and her tail wagged softly against the floor. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and watched him with quiet joy as he prepared their evening meal. That night, as she curled up on the blanket near the fire, her tail wrapped around her slender form, he lay awake on his bedding, staring at the flickering shadows dancing along the ceiling beams. There was a wordless truth blooming deep inside him, something primal and old, something dangerous. She was not just an animal. She was not just a girl. She was his. The winter deepened over the following weeks. Heavy snow fell almost daily, blanketing the pine forest in an endless white silence. The world felt muffled, hushed under the weight of drifting flakes and frosted branches. Yet inside the small cabin, warmth flickered in the form of firelight and quiet companionship. Cairo woke each morning to the sound of rustling fabric and gentle sweeping. The fox girl always rose before dawn, tidying his small home with silent devotion. Her tail moved rhythmically across the floor, sweeping stray pine needles and wood chips into neat piles. Her movements were precise and graceful, like a small priestess performing a sacred rite. Each time he saw her working in the pale morning light, something in his chest tightened painfully, a feeling he could not name, sharp and warm all at once. One morning, he watched her from his bedding as she crouched near the hearth, wiping soot from the stone ledge with a damp cloth. Her long hair spilled over her shoulders in dark silken waves, her ears flicking back and forth in focus. The tip of her fluffy blue tail twitched lightly with each motion. He found himself studying the curve of her neck, the small flicker of her throat as she swallowed. Her delicate fingers, tipped with small dark claws, moved with a precision and reverence that felt almost ceremonial. The flickering firelight made the pale crescent markings beneath her eyes glow faintly. When she finished, she bowed deeply to the hearth, placed the cloth neatly in its place, and turned to find him watching her. Her ears perked forward instantly, and she tilted her head slightly, blinking wide-eyed in silent question. He felt heat rising up his neck at being caught staring. He grunted and sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's fine. Just, come here." She approached on silent feet, her tail swishing softly behind her. She knelt beside his bedding, her hands resting lightly on her thighs. Her eyes remained lowered, though he could see the small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. He reached out, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. Her ears fluttered at his touch, and she shivered visibly, but she did not pull away. Her small intake of breath was almost inaudible, yet it sent a jolt of warmth down his chest. "Thank you," he murmured. Her smile widened just slightly, and she bowed her head lower, her tail flicking once against the floor in quiet joy. That day, Cairo took her hunting again. The sky was a dim gray, snow falling in fine, whispering flakes. She walked beside him this time instead of behind, her small footprints forming a parallel trail in the snow. They moved silently through the woods. Occasionally, she would sniff the air and tug lightly at his cloak, pointing with her nose towards fresh tracks hidden beneath the snow drifts. More than once, she led him straight to game he would have missed on his own. By midday, they had caught 2 rabbits and a grouse. As they sat beneath a towering pine to eat dried venison, she curled up beside him, pressing her shoulder lightly against his. Her body radiated a subtle warmth that seeped through his thick furs. She ate silently, her small fangs delicately tearing pieces of meat, ears flicking at every forest sound. He found himself reaching out to scratch gently behind her ears. She froze at the first touch, her eyes wide, then slowly melted into the contact, her tail wagging in slow, content arcs across the snow. She leaned into his hand, eyes half closed in bliss, and let out a small purring whine deep in her throat. His chest tightened painfully again. He withdrew his hand abruptly, clenching his jaw as heat pooled low in his stomach. She blinked at him in confusion, her ears tilting sideways, but she did not move away. Instead, she leaned her head lightly against his arm, as if reassuring him of her silent devotion. That evening, after returning to the cabin and preparing their meal, he sat by the fire sharpening his hunting knife. She sat across from him, sewing a torn section of his fur cloak with silent focus. The delicate way her clawed fingers manipulated the thick bone needle and sinew thread made him watch in quiet wonder. When she finished, she crawled across the floor on hands and knees to kneel before him. She held the newly mended cloak out with both hands, her head bowed low, her hair falling like a curtain around her face. He took it from her gently. "Thank you. That was good work." She glanced up, her ears flicking forward eagerly at his praise. Then she lowered her head again, pressing her forehead lightly against his knee. The gesture startled him, sending an electric jolt of heat through his body. He sat frozen, his hand hovering over her head, before he finally let it drop to rest gently against her hair. She shivered at the contact, letting out a small, quiet chitter that made his throat go dry. That night, he lay awake on his bedding, staring at the low flickering flames. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, rattling the shutters. The fox girl slept curled up on her blanket by the hearth, her tail wrapped snug around her body, her ears twitching occasionally in dream. His gaze lingered on her small sleeping form, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing, the soft sound she made as she nestled deeper into the warmth of the furs. She was not just a creature he had spared in the woods. She was something more. Something deeper. Something that had woven itself into his life with silent threads of devotion and obedience. She was his, whether he wanted to admit it or not. The following morning, he woke to find her kneeling beside his bedding. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her tail curled around her knees, and her bright blue eyes were locked onto his face with unwavering focus. He frowned sleepily. "What is it?" She tilted her head slightly, her ears flicking back in a submissive gesture. Then she slowly lifted her hands, holding out a small carved wooden figurine. It was shaped like a fox, with delicate markings etched into its sides to mimic her crescent cheek markings. He stared at it in stunned silence. She bowed her head low, her ears drooping in quiet humility, as if fearing his displeasure. He reached out with shaking fingers, taking the figurine from her hands. The wood was smooth and warm from her touch. He turned it over, studying the delicate detail, the careful lines carved by her small claws. "It's beautiful," he whispered. Her ears perked up instantly, and her tail wagged once behind her in silent joy. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead lightly against his chest, her hands clutching his blanket in trembling relief. He didn't stop her. He simply let his hand rest gently against the back of her head, feeling the small tremors that ran through her body. "Thank you," he murmured again, his voice almost inaudible over the crackling fire. I don't deserve this." She pulled back slightly to look up at him, her bright eyes shimmering with a silent truth he could not deny. Then she leaned forward again, pressing her cheek against his chest with quiet determination. And in that moment, as the first rays of dawn broke over the snow-covered forest, Cairo understood something he had been trying to ignore. He could no longer imagine his world without her in it. Winter's grip tightened over the forest, wrapping the pines and cliffs in a suffocating blanket of white silence. Each morning, the frost lay thicker, coating the cabin windows until the dawn light barely penetrated within. Yet the small hearth burned warm with flickering firelight, and in that silent world, two lives continued to weave together, thread by invisible thread. Cairo rose each day to find the fox girl kneeling before him, her forehead pressed lightly to the floorboards in greeting. She had taken to this new morning ritual without instruction. Her devotion was wordless but clear, and each time he saw her small form bowed in such reverence, a strange aching warmth spread through his chest. One bitter dawn, the snow fell so heavily that even Cairo did not risk hunting. Instead, he spent the morning repairing his traps, restringing his bow, and sharpening his knives by the fire. The fox girl sat quietly beside him, her small clawed hands folded neatly in her lap, her tail wrapped around her knees like a soft blue plume. After some time, she tilted her head, her ears flicking curiously as she studied his face. Then, slowly, she crawled to the far corner of the cabin where he kept his spare wood. She selected a smooth branch and returned to the hearth, sitting cross-legged as she began to carve. Her claws moved with delicate precision, curling strips of bark away to reveal the pale wood beneath. Cairo watched her out of the corner of his eye, pretending to focus on his knives, though in truth he could not tear his gaze away from her fluid, graceful motions. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the whisper of snow against the window shutters and the crackling fire between them. By midday, she held up her work to him with both hands, bowing her head low. He turned fully towards her, frowning in quiet confusion. In her hands lay another carving, this time, it was of a man. The figure was crude but unmistakable, with broad shoulders and a hooded cloak. Small notches marked the eyes beneath the carved brow, and he realized with a strange tightening in his chest that she had even etched the scar that ran across his left eyebrow. He reached out and took it from her trembling fingers. She stayed bowed before him, her ears drooping in silent submission as if awaiting judgment. His voice came out rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. "It's good. You did well." She let out a small chittering whine at his praise, her tail flicking rapidly behind her. Then, slowly, she raised her head, her eyes locked onto his with fierce devotion. Without breaking eye contact, she reached into her small woven pouch and pulled out the fox carving she had made before. Gently, with shaking hands, she placed both figurines side by side on the hearthstone. Her ears fluttered once. Her tail curled tightly around her waist. Then she pressed her forehead lightly against his knee and stayed there, trembling slightly. Cairo stared at the two small figurines, the hunter and the fox, sitting together before the fire. A lump rose in his throat that he could not swallow down. He reached down and placed his hand atop her head, feeling her shiver beneath his touch. That evening, as they prepared to sleep, she approached his bedding in silence. Kneeling beside him, she looked up with wide, questioning eyes, her ears twitching nervously. "What is it?" he asked gruffly, though his voice softened as he met her gaze. She hesitated, then reached out and lightly touched his chest with her clawed fingertips. She pulled back quickly, bowing her head in apology, her tail curling around her legs in fearful submission. But Cairo shook his head. "No, it's fine." She raised her head again, ears flicking forward in hope. Then, with trembling hands, she gestured to herself, then to him, and then tapped her chest twice before tilting her head in question. It took him a long moment to understand. When he did, his chest tightened painfully. "You want a name?" She blinked, then nodded quickly, her tail wagging once against the floor in silent joy. She bowed her head again, pressing her forehead to the ground, waiting. Cairo swallowed hard, staring at the flickering firelight dancing across her small, trembling form. He thought of her silent devotion. Of the way she cleaned his home each dawn, waited for his commands, pressed herself against his side for warmth, and carved his image into wood with trembling reverence. Slowly, he reached out and placed his hand gently atop her head. Her ears fluttered rapidly at his touch, and she let out a small, quiet chitter of anticipation. "Yura," he said softly. "Your name is Yura." She froze. Then, slowly, she lifted her head to look up at him, her bright blue eyes shimmering with tears. Her lips parted in a silent gasp, and a small sob escaped her throat as she pressed her forehead against his knee again, her shoulders trembling with quiet emotion. "Yura," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper over the crackling fire. "That's who you are." Her tail thumped softly against the floor, her ears flicking forward in blissful relief. She pressed closer to him, clutching his blanket in her small hands as if anchoring herself to his presence. And in that moment, as the winter storm howled outside, Cairo realized the truth that had been growing silently within him all along. She was no longer just a creature he had spared in the forest. She was his. And he was hers.